Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is episode 23, Overpopulation and Environmental Collapse. The 60s were a time of growing awareness of threats to the environment. Conservation, the direct protection of natural spaces and endangered animals, already had a long history, but this awareness was broadening. Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, warning of the dangers of excessive pesticide use, in 1962. The United States passed the Clean Air Act in 1963, the Clean Water Act in 1972, and the Endangered Species Act in 1973. The famous Earthrise photo taken by Apollo 8 in 1968, which is credited by some with starting the modern environmental movement, and the first Earth Day in 1970 are testament to the influence of the movement with the public. It's no surprise, then, that these themes also appeared in science fiction, especially during the socially conscious New Wave movement. And like the nuclear war stories discussed in the previous episode, they tended to appear in cautionary tales, warning of the horrors of a future polluted and resource-exhausted Earth. Going hand in hand with this, and I think actually more prominent, was the fear of overpopulation. Alongside all of the other environmental warnings, in 1968, Stanford professor Paul Ehrlich, with the help of his wife Anne, released the best-selling book The Population Bomb, which catapulted the issue to the forefront of society's awareness. Worry about overpopulation had been brewing since shortly after World War II, as an unprecedented period of technological progress and population growth spread across the world. However, The Population Bomb painted it in a new and vivid light. The book was sensationalist to modernize and has since been widely derided by critics as fear-mongering. There's some basis for this. The first edition predicted that it was already too late to stop massive famines from killing hundreds of millions of people in places like India within 10 years. And that didn't happen because technological progress in agriculture was able to keep up much better than expected. But Ehrlich still stands by his central message today that we are outstripping our planet's resources. This podcast is about science fiction, though, and science fiction can go to far wilder and darker places than science fact. Overpopulation appeared in many stories even before Ehrlich made his mark. Some of Asimov's and Heinlein's early stories touch on it, for example. The original Star Trek tackled it, albeit in a pretty weird way, in The Mark of Gideon, where an overpopulated planet, because of their idiosyncratic religious views, decides the best way to control their population is to start a global plague. The writers weren't really thinking there, and not just because of the main plot. The episode was filmed as if people were standing shoulder to shoulder across the whole planet, something that seems to be a common misconception of the trope. But the numbers for that are too outrageous to contemplate. J.G. Ballard dove into the topic with his 1962 short story Billennium. Ballard depicts a future world of 20 billion people, and unlike Star Trek, he recognized that by itself wouldn't be physically overcrowded. But, he says, the need for enough farmland to feed 20 billion people has forced the population into hopelessly overcrowded cities, where the streets are constantly choked with pedestrians, and people are forced into tiny cubicles to sleep like capsule hotels in Japan. But be careful with that story. I actually felt uncomfortable being in a crowd for the rest of the day after I read it. Overpopulation was such a powerful idea that even though many countries in Europe and East Asia are suffering from an underpopulation crisis today, it remains widely used in fiction, most recently as the motivation for Thanos' villainy in the Avengers movies. However, there are two books from the New Wave that really typify this trope: Stand on Zanzibar by John Brunner, and Make Room by Harry Harrison, the latter of which is better known from its loose film adaptation, Soylent Green. Even if you haven't seen it, you've probably heard of Soylent Green. An overpopulated world suffering a crisis of food supply, and Charlton Heston yelling, "Soylent Green is people!" Except that's nothing like the book. Not to mention it's blatantly against the laws of physics. You can't feed people to people without losing a lot of energy. There aren't enough people to go around. The Matrix made the same mistake. So did the Windup girl, although not with regard to food. Google trophic levels. That'll tell you all about it. Sorry, scientist's pet peeve. Anyway, in Harry Harrison's book, Soylent Green is not people. In fact, Soylent Green isn't even Soylent Green. Soylent, no color specified, is actually exactly what the name says, a protein-rich blend of soybeans and lentils. It's basically a veggie burger, something that has been available in the real world for those who want it since the 80s. Now that we have the Impossible Burger and its competitors, we've arguably surpassed Harrison's prediction there. Anyway, the story is set in 1999, in a New York City crowded with 35 million people. It wanders around, showing the effect on people in all walks of life of living in a city that is strained to the breaking point by riots, shortages, people dying on the streets, and general political unrest. It's sensational, much like The Population Bomb, which was published 2 years later. And, also like The Population Bomb, it feels awfully dated today. In fact, parts of it were based on assumptions that were wrong even at the time it was written, which I thought weakened the storyline. It's interesting, really. Make Room, and Stand on Zanzibar both got their predictions of world population pretty close to right. They both predicted the world would have 7 billion people in it. Make Room in 1999, and Stand on Zanzibar in 2010, only 1 year off the real milestone in 2011. But on the other hand, both of these books predicted that 7 billion people would leave the world hopelessly, cripplingly overpopulated. Make Room is worse in my opinion. Harrison not only shows massive shortages of housing and food, the cheapest food isn't even Soylent, it's seaweed. He also depicts widespread resistance to and political debate over birth control, even though it was published after the Supreme Court legalized it in the United States. He also shows large families with 7 kids being unremarkable, even though they were unusual in America even then. The 50s were the era of 2.5 children, after all. Now, of course, we're closing in on 8 billion people. Food is not our biggest problem in most of the world, and while big cities do struggle with housing, it's not 10 people to an apartment bad. Also, birth rates have dropped precipitously in most of the world in the intervening decades. Earth's population growth rate actually peaked in 1968, the very year that The Population Bomb was published. If we had kept growing at that rate until 2010, there would have been 8.5 billion humans by then, and over 10 billion today. Stand on Zanzibar, written by John Brunner also in 1968, was the other famous book about overpopulation from that time. The title refers to an unusual calculation. I can't find an original source, but apparently, sometime in the early 20th century, someone calculated that the then 2 billion people in the world would be able to stand shoulder to shoulder on the Isle of Wight off the coast of England. By this standard, Brunner calculated that the 7 billion people of 2010 would fit shoulder to shoulder on the former British colony of Zanzibar off the coast of Africa, now part of Tanzania. You can tell Brunner was British by those comparisons. As in America, I know where those islands are, but I don't have any intuitive idea of how big they are. An American author might have fit the 2 billion people of the early 20th century onto Guam, and they might have titled the book Stand on Oahu. But I have to say, Stand on Zanzibar is really good. People today like to bring it up to talk about how accurately it predicted the future, and yes, Brunner did better than most, but it is just one of the best executed stories I have seen on my entire reading list, even if, or perhaps because, it's very unconventional. Brunner has that immersive style of world building that throws you in the deep end and really makes you feel like you're in his world, which I really love when it's done well. I first encountered that style in Existence by David Brin, which I still considered the gold standard, but Brunner pulls it off nearly as well. He does this first by inventing futuristic vocabulary, concepts, and slang, and generally leaving the reader to figure them out from context, but still keeping it understandable. And second, by giving the reader enough background information and flavor text to feel like it came from a larger, more developed world. He's especially innovative in how he writes chapters in multiple different formats. These include context, which consists of news headlines, quotations, advertisements, and excerpts from in-story publications. The Happening World, a collection of snippets, only a few sentences each, showing the chaotic events happening around the globe. tracking with close-ups, vignettes about side characters, sometimes relevant to the plot and sometimes just there for flavor. And finally, continuity, which is the actual narrative. Then there's the fact that he invents new countries to tell the story in, which is pretty standard fare in fiction, but he goes on to invent very specific geography for those countries, making them feel real. There's Beninia in West Africa, named for the Bight of Benin, not the country of Benin, which was called Dahomey at the time. It seems to correspond to the real-world Togo, but has a geography more similar to the Gambia. And there's also Yatakang, a large and powerful communist island nation wedged between Indonesia and the Philippines, whose islands are described in great detail, enough that you could put them on the map if there was room. Brunner also does a lot with the fictional publications in the story, from the interactive news, culture, and entertainment television that casts the viewer into the story as Mr. and Mrs. Everywhere, to the various books written by one of Brunner's most iconic characters, Chad C. Mulligan. Mulligan is a pop sociologist turned countercultural icon, writing books like You're an Ignorant Idiot, Better ? Than ? and You, Beast. Sorry, the titles don't really work without the punctuation. He's kind of hard to describe. He's the sort of science rock star figure that you don't really see in the real world in sociology. Anyway, Mulligan's most famous and subversive book is The Hip Crime Vocab, a book of satirical definitions of various words and slang, a little bit Urban Dictionary, and a little bit George Carlin, but seemingly inspired by Ambrose Bierce's 1911 satire The Devil's Dictionary. Mulligan's definition of hip crime is, quote, "You committed one when you opened this book. Keep it up. It's our only hope." Unquote. And it occurs to me that after all this, I haven't actually said what the book is about. The only reason I can really give for that is that the book is complicated, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It works really well if you're reading it. It's just that with this immersive style, I feel like if you try to give a summary of the story, you have to give a lot of context in order for that summary to make sense. Or maybe it's not the summary I'm trying to make sense of, but the relevance of the book to the topic, and its significance to the history of sci-fi in general. Anyway, there are two main plot lines in the book. One is an attempt by the megacorp General Technics to take over the management of Beninia and make a pile of money off of developing it to first world status. The other is an investigation into a new genetic engineering technology in Yatakang that promises to make designer babies free from genetic defects, and that will allow a relaxation of the current regime of eugenics laws. That's the big shock factor with regard to overpopulation in Stand on Zanzibar. In a time 2 generations closer to World War II than today, Brunner writes a future where eugenics is the law of the land in just about every country in the world. It's achieved by genetic screening and mandated contraception, not the far worse methods invoked by 20th century dictators, but it's still surprising to see. You actually don't see much about famine in Stand on Zanzibar because of those eugenics laws. It comes up more in The Sheep Look Up. Instead, we see the knock-on effects of the eugenics laws and the overcrowded world generally. Social unrest, widening inequality, rising mental illness, political extremism, and the effects of technology on society. And while it's perhaps not the best-known book on my reading list, it has had renewed interest in recent years for the accuracy of many of Brunner's predictions about the future, and not just the population figures. He predicted a rise in random acts of violence like mass shootings, as well as terrorist attacks. He predicted the social acceptance of homosexuality, the legalization of marijuana, and many other social trends, although you could debate how obvious some of them were. In technology, he predicted electric cars, laser printers, satellite television, on-demand television, and even something resembling today's social media. He even has an African character named President Obomi. He's the president of Beninia, not America, so that one's a bit of a stretch. But in terms of his social position in that world, he still bears an uncanny resemblance to Barack Obama. And one final point I found interesting. Stand on Zanzibar contains what I'm pretty sure is the most epic insult I have ever seen in any medium, delivered by Donald when Sugai Guntung first appears. Not even in Shakespeare have I seen one equal to it in sheer scale. I won't quote it because it's not family-friendly, but it's pretty insane, and it just stood out to me when I read it. Honestly, I'm a little worried I'm over-explaining this book. Maybe, like explaining a joke, explaining the nuances of a book written in this immersive style makes it fall flat. But again, I find it hard to describe what the book means to the genre without it. And you really do need to read it to get the depth of experience. Overpopulation in fiction has looked a bit different in more recent times. It does appear quite a bit in the cyberpunk era, but it's less often addressed directly. Like nuclear war, it tends to appear in the backstory of many other works of future history, often as a motivation for space colonization. Ringworld, Firefly, Avatar, Terra Nova, and so on. It's invoked surprisingly often by villains as a motive for their genocidal plots. See Kingsman: The Secret Service and Avengers: Infinity War. Honestly, it annoys me when people invoke overpopulation unironically in this day and age, even if it's the villain doing it, because it's not relevant anymore, not like it used to be. Granted, many climate advocates and other thinkers still say it is, but I claim that's really a matter of overconsumption, not overpopulation per se, because population growth has fallen so much. It's a problem, but it's not really the same problem anymore. As much as I enjoyed Infinity War, it still annoyed me a little that they used that as Thanos' motivation. If you ever find yourself wondering if Thanos had a point, Google demographic transitions. Anyway, I've spent a lot of time on this, but overpopulation isn't the only trope we're looking at here. There's also the matter of damage done to the environment directly. And to see one of the most haunting takes on that, we need look no further than John Brunner's other landmark book, The Sheep Look Up. This book is set sooner than Stand on Zanzibar, possibly as early as the late 80s. But it's in a world where America and the rest of the developed world failed to address the problem of pollution, and sometimes exacerbated by war. One plot point is that the use of herbicides like Agent Orange in the Vietnam War, which was still going on when the book was written, has turned the entire country into an uninhabitable mud pit. But mainly it's generic pollution. I thought Brunner was more pessimistic in this book, and he also didn't recapture the immersive feeling of Stand on Zanzibar. He uses a similar structure, and a Chad Mulligan lookalike named Austin Train, but it didn't come across as having quite as much depth and complexity, although there's still a lot. His predictions feel less like predictions and more like worst-case scenarios, more typical cautionary tale fare. Although the Clean Air Act was already in place at the time, in Brunner's future it failed to lift the smog in California, and in many places it's dangerous to go outside without a filter mask, which is a prediction that we can relate to today, but for a very different reason. I don't know how familiar Brunner was with the Clean Air Act being British, although I'll grant that he correctly predicted the dangers of as yet unaddressed pollutants like leaded gasoline. Along with the air, the water is poisoned in many places. The Clean Water Act had not been passed at the time. Industrial waste has poisoned many lakes and rivers and even the entire Mediterranean Sea, killing the fish and making much of the water supply undrinkable. On land, pesticide-resistant bugs and antibiotic-resistant bacteria have become plagues. The pests and pollution have made it so hard to grow food that famine is starting to set in even in America. The average life expectancy has started going down, and rates of birth defects and intellectual disabilities have skyrocketed, to the point where few children are born healthy in hard-hit areas. The book follows various people on a tragedy-filled course over 1 year, as all of these problems come to a head, and the United States descends into chaos and flames, in parallel with mysterious outbreaks of insanity that seem to stem from one of the processed food factories that are shoring up the food supply. It feels much more dated now, but I will note that Austin Train's vision of a restored, pristine Earth is an extremely powerful image, and in its own way actually helps to sell the story. Pollution is another one that you don't see as much of directly these days. It was also a backdrop for the cyberpunk era, which we'll talk about when we get to the 80s, and you do sometimes see the dangers of pollution played straight. For example, there's Ted Turner's 1990s cartoon Captain Planet, which, as a superhero series, does qualify as sci-fi. More recently, you have the Pixar film Wall-E. However, that's not where the majority of our worries are now. By the 1970s, I think people were more aware of and obviously interested in mitigating pollution that affected them directly, well above the level of blind business interests, which are often invoked as the motivation for the polluters. Environmental themes are still quite common, but they've all been swept up in the overarching issue of climate change, sometimes mixed in with societal breakdown and, more recently, genetic engineering. You see this in movies like Mad Max, Waterworld, and The Day After Tomorrow. You see it in books like Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, which we'll talk about in a few episodes. You see it in allegorical form in books like Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle and even Asimov's The Gods Themselves, which was written around the same time as The Sheep Look Up. One notable instance from the past decade or so is The Windup Girl by Paolo Bacigalupi. Considered to be a modern classic of sci-fi, The Windup Girl paints a vision of a world 2 centuries in the future that has been ravaged by global warming, the depletion of fossil fuels, and out-of-control genetically modified organisms. However, I don't have a lot to say about The Windup Girl as a story because I couldn't get through it. I really wanted to like it. It has the same immersive world building as Existence and Stand on Zanzibar, and that part was done really well. But it failed on the suspension of disbelief point, because there's no renewable energy in this future. No solar, no wind, no nuclear, or at least not enough to matter, and I just couldn't buy it. Not to mention that Bacigalupi makes the same mistake as Soylent Green and The Matrix do, just indirectly. He has spring-powered vehicles, which isn't impossible with appropriate supermaterials, but he has those springs being wound up by genetically modified elephants pushing a giant capstan around. And that makes no sense. Animal power is incredibly inefficient because animals have to eat. It would be literally 10 times more efficient to power vehicles with plant-derived biofuel, which does exist in the book in limited quantities. I think the problem is that this book purports to be, or is purported to be in the media, a hard sci-fi take on a possible dark future, but it's not. In an interview with IO9, Bacigalupi explained that he wasn't trying to write a predictive story. Instead, he was going for a certain aesthetic of a world crippled by an energy crisis. And that didn't work with the alternative energy sources available, so he just got rid of them. Unfortunately, that made the book not work for me. I know it sounds silly to say about a science fiction book, but it was too unrealistic for me to take seriously. In a world that at least purported to hold a mirror up to ours, it was too big a hole. Too much of that world didn't make sense for me to enjoy the book. Oddly enough, I got the same vibe of too unrealistic to take seriously from China Miéville's The City and the City, which coincidentally shared the Hugo Award with The Windup Girl in 2010. There's a place for surrealist fiction, but I think there's a certain element of internal consistency needed that, say, Philip K. Dick or J.G. Ballard have, but these books lack. Maybe you'll like The Windup Girl better than I did. It's highly critically acclaimed, so maybe I just have a non-standard perspective on these kinds of books. I did enjoy the earlier books in this subgenre, even the ones that seem pretty dated today. Plus, they offer a unique perspective, perhaps more than most parts of the sci-fi universe, about what people in the past thought the future might be like. And I think that alone is worth a look. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. And with this episode, we have reached the halfway point of this podcast, at least as currently scheduled. It's hard to believe we've come this far, but there's still plenty more to come. This podcast, as always, is available most places you listen to podcasts, and you can also check out my website, sciencemeetsfiction.com, both for this podcast and my other writings. For example, last week, I published my first new science fiction short story in a long time, The Gordian Paradox. My book recommendation of the episode, if you couldn't tell, is Stand on Zanzibar. Yes, it's dated in some ways, but it is a really good book, and one of the most fun reads on my entire list. You should definitely check it out. The next episode will be the final one about the many disaster stories of the New Wave and beyond. These are the new dystopias. Thanks for listening.